The morning of September 12, 1945, broke cold and cloudless over the Chesapeake Bay. The war had been over for exactly 27 days. In the skies above Patuxent River Naval Air Station, Maryland, the air still tasted of salt and aviation fuel, but the urgency had drained away. No enemy fighters would appear on the horizon. No bombs would fall. Yet in the control tower, a different kind of tension hummed through the equipment racks and between the men in uniform who stood watching oscilloscope screens flicker with green phosphorescent light. Lieutenant Commander James Howell checked his wristwatch, 0847 hours, and keyed the microphone. His voice crackled across the frequency to the pilots waiting in their cockpits on the tarmac below. Able flight, you are cleared for departure. Proceed to waypoint Alpha and await further instruction. 3 aircraft engines coughed to life in sequence. First, the deep-throated roar of a P-51D Mustang, the fighter that had escorted bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Second, the twin growls of a P-38 Lightning, its distinctive twin-boom silhouette unmistakable even from the tower. Third, the angry snarl of a captured Focke-Wulf FW-190, still bearing faded Luftwaffe crosses beneath a hasty coat of American white paint. These were not relics. These were the apex predators of the war that had just ended, the fastest, most maneuverable, most lethal aircraft that human ingenuity and industrial might had produced. And today, they would be hunted, not by pilots, not by anti-aircraft guns, but by invisible waves of electromagnetic radiation, pulsing out from arrays of antennas and reflectors scattered across the Maryland coastline, by radar, the secret weapon that had turned the tide of war long before the first atomic bomb ever fell. When the war ended in the summer of 1945, the world believed it understood why the Allies had won. They spoke of industrial capacity, of the arsenal of democracy, of brave men storming beaches and flying through flak. They spoke of the atomic bomb, that terrible new sun that had risen twice over Japan. But within the classified halls of the United States Navy and Army Air Forces, another story was being written. A quieter story, one written in wavelengths and reflected pulses, in cathode ray tubes and rotating antennas. Radar had won the war, not alone, but decisively. It had detected the Luftwaffe's bombers over Britain in 1940, giving fighter command the precious minutes needed to scramble Spitfires and Hurricanes. It had found German U-boats on the surface of the Atlantic in 1943, turning the Battle of the Atlantic from a desperate struggle into a systematic hunt. It had guided night fighters to Japanese bombers over the Pacific, and directed naval gunfire with uncanny accuracy against ships that could not even see their attackers. But the radar systems used during the war had been designed in desperate haste, built under the pressure of immediate necessity. The British chain home stations used wavelengths measured in meters, crude but effective. American shipboard sets like the SC and SG models had been revolutionary in 1942 but were already obsolescent by 1945. The Germans had developed their own radar, the Würzburg and Freya systems, which had been effective enough. Until Allied bombers began dropping clouds of metal chaff called window, that turned their screens into useless snowstorms of false returns. Now, with the war over, American engineers faced a different question: how good could radar actually become? The military hierarchies of the defeated Axis powers had believed their aircraft were untouchable when flown by skilled pilots at high speed and low altitude. The FW-190 could exceed 400 miles per hour. The Mitsubishi A6M0 could turn inside any American fighter in 1942. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet could fly at 540 miles per hour, faster than any piston-engine plane could dream. But speed and maneuverability meant nothing if the enemy always knew where you were, if they could see you through clouds, through darkness, through the very curvature of the Earth itself. The test program established at Patuxent River in September 1945 had a simple mandate: take the best radar systems America had developed by the war's end, and test them against the best aircraft from all sides of the conflict. Find the limits, find the weaknesses, and then surpass them. The pilots who flew that September morning had expected a routine evaluation flight, high-altitude runs, low-altitude passes, evasive maneuvers at prescribed intervals. They were test pilots, accustomed to wringing out new aircraft designs, to finding the edge of the performance envelope and then pushing beyond it. They understood their role: be the target, make it difficult, see if the radar operators could maintain contact. What they had not expected was to feel hunted. Captain Raymond Ford, strapped into the cockpit of the Mustang, advanced his throttle and felt the Packard-built Merlin engine surge with power. The P-51 lifted cleanly from the runway, gear retracting with solid thuds into the wings. He climbed to 15,000 feet and turned north, following the Chesapeake coastline, waiting for the radio call that would begin the exercise. Able 1, this is lookup. We have radar contact. Bearing 020, range 32 miles, altitude 15,000. Please confirm. Ford glanced at his instruments. The bearing was exact. The range was exact. The altitude was exact. They had detected him the moment he left the traffic pattern. Lookup, Able 1 confirms. Beginning evasive sequence. He pushed the stick forward and dove, bleeding altitude rapidly, leveling out at 5,000 feet and turning west, away from the coast, away from the radar stations. He dropped lower, down to 1,000 feet, then 500, until the Mustang's propeller seemed to skim the treetops of the Maryland pine forests. This was the technique that had worked against German Würzburg radar in 1944, get low, hide in the ground clutter, become invisible against the background noise of reflected terrain. Able 1, lookup. We still hold contact. Bearing 275, range 18 miles, altitude 500 feet. You're not getting away from us, Captain. There was amusement in the radar operator's voice. Not mockery, but the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman demonstrating his tools. Ford felt something unfamiliar, not fear, but a profound unease. He was flying one of the finest fighter aircraft ever built, employing tactics that had saved countless lives over occupied Europe, and he was as visible to these radar sets as if he were trailing smoke and fire. He could not hide. He could not evade. Every turn, every climb, every desperate maneuver showed up on those green screens as a bright blip, tracked with relentless precision. In the P-38, Lieutenant Marcus Chen experienced the same revelation. The twin-engine Lightning could outclimb almost anything, and Chen used that advantage, spiraling upward to 25,000 feet, then cutting his engines and gliding silently, trying to reduce his radar cross-section to nothing. For 30 seconds, he hung in the sky like a bird of prey, engineless, nearly soundless. Able 2, lookup has continuous contact. We never lost you, not even in the glide. Chen restarted his engines and resumed the test profile, but his mind was elsewhere. He had fought in the Pacific, had survived encounters with Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire, had learned to trust his instincts and his aircraft. But instinct meant nothing against radar. Aircraft performance meant nothing. The electromagnetic spectrum was a battlefield he could not see, could not fight on, could not escape. The FW190, flown by a former Luftwaffe pilot named Heinrich Müller who now worked as a civilian contractor for the U.S. Navy, fared no better. Müller had flown combat missions over the Reich, had survived the desperate fighting of 1944 and 1945, had employed every trick and tactic the Jagdwaffe had developed. He flew at wave-top height over the Chesapeake, rolled inverted and dove toward the water, pulled out at the last possible second and climbed vertically with full throttle. The American radar tracked him through every maneuver, calling out his position with casual precision. When the three aircraft landed 90 minutes later, the pilots climbed out of their cockpits in silence. There was no debriefing necessary. They understood what they had experienced. The age of the invisible fighter was over before it had truly begun. The radar systems tested that September were not experimental prototypes. They were operational systems, already in production, already being installed aboard ships and at air defense stations around the United States and its occupied territories. The N/APS-10 airborne radar could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 50 miles. The N/TPS-1 ground-based system, mounted on a mobile trailer, could track multiple targets simultaneously and provide precise range, bearing, and altitude data. The N/APQ-13, designed for bomber navigation and targeting, could map terrain through solid cloud cover and detect ships on a dark ocean from 10,000 feet. These systems operated on centimetric wavelengths, between 3 and 10 centimeters, far shorter than the metric wavelengths of early war radar. This gave them extraordinary resolution. They could distinguish between aircraft flying in close formation. They could detect small boats on a choppy sea. They could measure altitude with accuracy measured in tens of feet, not hundreds. And they were nearly immune to the chaff countermeasures that had blinded German radar. The engineering behind these systems represented a triumph of American industrial and scientific coordination. The Radiation Laboratory at MIT had designed many of the key components. Western Electric, RCA, and General Electric had manufactured them in quantities unimaginable before the war. The telephone laboratories had developed the signal processing techniques that extracted faint aircraft returns from background noise. Physicists who had once studied cosmic rays and atomic structure now calculated antenna patterns and waveguide dimensions. But the radar itself was only half of the system. The other half was human, the operators who interpreted the glowing traces on oscilloscope screens, who learned to distinguish aircraft from weather, who could estimate speed and heading from the movement of a blip across a grid, who could maintain contact with a maneuvering target while simultaneously tracking 3 others. In the control room at Patuxent River, Petty Officer First Class William Chen, no relation to the pilot, sat before an N/TPS-1 scope, his face bathed in green light. He had been tracking aircraft for 2 years, first aboard a destroyer in the Pacific, now at this test station. His hands moved across the controls with unconscious precision, adjusting gain and sweep rate, compensating for weather interference, marking target tracks on a grease pencil overlay. Target Alpha at 315, 22 miles, altitude 1,000 feet. Target Bravo at 040, 30 miles, altitude 25,000. Target Charlie at 180, 15 miles, altitude 500, high speed. The supervisor, Lieutenant Commander Howell, watched over Chen's shoulder. Can you tell which is which? Chen studied the returns, noting the strength of the echo, the pattern of its movement. Target Alpha is the P-38, twin engines give a stronger return at that angle. Bravo is the Mustang at altitude. Charlie is the FW190, and he's pushing it, probably over 400 knots. Howell nodded. This was the level of skill that radar operation required, not just detecting targets, but identifying them, understanding their behavior, predicting their intentions. During the war, this skill had meant the difference between scrambling fighters in time or letting enemy bombers through. Now, in peace, it meant understanding what was possible. Range to target Charlie, 14 miles, 13, 12. He's turning east, probably trying for another low-level run. Stay with him. He's not going anywhere. I can't see him, sir. The German and Japanese pilots who had fought against American forces in the war's final years had known about radar. They had known it existed, had known it gave their enemies an advantage, had known that somehow the Americans and British could find them in darkness and cloud. But knowing that radar existed and understanding what it meant were different things. The Luftwaffe had developed sophisticated tactics for night fighting, using their own airborne radar to locate British bombers. But those tactics assumed that both sides were equally blind, that the battle was fought between hunters who could barely see their prey. The Japanese had experienced something different. They had faced American night fighters equipped with radar over the Pacific, planes that appeared from nowhere and fired from invisible positions. But even then, the prevailing assumption was that radar was a tactical advantage, not a strategic transformation. What the Axis powers had not grasped, what they could not grasp, because their industrial and scientific infrastructures were collapsing by 1944, was the sheer scale of American radar deployment and the speed of its improvement. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, there were over 100,000 radar sets in American military service. They ranged from massive ground-based early warning systems that could detect bombers 300 miles away, to compact airborne intercept radars that fit in the nose of a night fighter, to naval fire control radars that could track shells in flight and correct the aim of the next salvo. The United States was producing radar sets at a rate of more than 50,000 per year. Every major surface warship carried multiple radar systems. Every bomber group had radar-equipped pathfinders. Every fighter direction center had multiple redundant sets. The Kriegsmarine had learned the hard way what this meant. In the spring of 1943, German U-boats suddenly began dying at an unprecedented rate. Boats that had been undetectable on the surface at night were being caught by Allied aircraft and warships with uncanny accuracy. Admiral Donat suspected radar, but German intelligence could not determine how the Allies were doing it. The answer was centimetric radar, operating on wavelengths so short that the German U-boats' radar warning receivers could not detect them. By the time Germany developed countermeasures, the Battle of the Atlantic was already lost. The Luftwaffe had experienced a different nightmare. In 1943 and 1944, the American 8th Air Force bombed Germany in daylight, accepting terrible losses in exchange for precision. But when weather obscured the targets, the bombers used radar to navigate and bomb through solid cloud cover. The H-2X radar system allowed a bombardier to identify cities, rivers, and coastlines on his scope, and release bombs with reasonable accuracy without ever seeing the ground. German civilians called these Terrorangriff, terror raids, but they were something more systematic than terror. They were the methodical destruction of German industrial capacity, carried out with a technology that rendered traditional defenses nearly obsolete. For the Japanese, radar had been equally devastating but differently experienced. The kamikaze attacks of 1945 were born partly from desperation, but partly from the recognition that conventional aircraft could not survive the radar-directed combat air patrols that surrounded American carrier task forces. The American radar picket ships, positioned far from the main fleet, could detect incoming raids at ranges exceeding 100 miles and vector fighters to intercept long before the attackers reached their targets. The only counter was to send so many aircraft that some would inevitably get through, a calculus of death that Japan could not sustain. Now, in September 1945, the full scope of that technological advantage was becoming clear. American engineers were dissecting captured German and Japanese radar systems and finding them to be competent, sometimes ingenious, but always years behind the American state-of-the-art. More significantly, they were finding that Axis radar production had been minuscule. Germany had produced perhaps 20,000 radar sets during the entire war. Japan, even fewer. Neither nation had achieved the industrial scale necessary to make radar ubiquitous, and ubiquity was what made radar truly decisive. The symbolic object in this story is not a weapon, nor food, but something more subtle, the oscilloscope screen itself, that circular window of phosphorescent green light. In the control room at Patuxent River, the radar scopes glowed day and night, painting their electronic picture of the sky. The operators watched them with a concentration that bordered on meditation, learning to read meaning in the patterns of light, to distinguish between aircraft and birds, between solid returns and ghostly reflections from the ionosphere, between reality and noise. That green glow represented a fundamental transformation in warfare, the transformation from combat as a contest of human perception to combat as a contest of electromagnetic physics. For thousands of years, warfare had been limited by what humans could see, hear, and sense. Armies fought by day because night was impenetrable. Ships engaged at ranges where lookouts could spot their enemies. Aircraft fought within visual range because there was no other way to find a target. Radar broke that ancient limitation. It gave humans perception beyond their senses, made the invisible visible, turned darkness into a different kind of light. The green glow on those oscilloscope screens was the glow of a new kind of sight, electronic, omnidirectional, immune to darkness and weather, limited only by the curvature of the Earth and the sensitivity of the receiver. For the pilots who flew against it that September, the green glow represented something unsettling. The end of the romantic era of aerial combat. There would be no more surprise attacks out of the sun, no more hiding in clouds, no more relying on a pilot's instincts and situational awareness. The sky had become transparent. Every aircraft was visible. Every movement was tracked. Combat would become a mathematical exercise in detection range, missile speed, and countermeasure effectiveness. But for the radar operators, that same green glow represented empowerment. They were not pilots, not traditional warriors. Many of them were technicians, trained in electronics and mathematics rather than tactics and gunnery. Yet they wielded more power than any fighter ace. With a glance at a scope, they could direct interceptors to an enemy bomber formation. With a radio call, they could save a friendly aircraft from an ambush. The green glow made them the eyes of the fleet, the sentinels of the airspace, the invisible guardians who fought a war of information before a single shot was fired. In the months following the Patuxent River tests, that oscilloscope became ubiquitous in American military iconography. Training films showed radar operators at their stations, faces illuminated by green light, headphones clamped over their ears. Recruitment posters depicted the radar scope with reverent detail, as if it were a religious icon. In a sense, it represented the faith that technology could substitute for courage, that information could substitute for firepower, that a nation rich enough to blanket the world with electronic sensors could wage war with calculated efficiency rather than desperate bravery. The transformation in military thinking that followed the Patuxent River tests was subtle but profound. Before the war, air defense had been reactive, spot the enemy, scramble fighters, hope to intercept before they reached their target. Radar made air defense proactive. With sufficient radar coverage, hostile aircraft could be detected at the moment they took off from their bases. Their routes could be predicted, their intentions analyzed, and overwhelming force positioned to intercept them at the most advantageous point. This shift from reactive to proactive defense had implications far beyond air combat. It meant that the advantage in warfare was shifting from the offensive to the defensive, from the attacker to the warned. It meant that surprise attacks, the kind that had devastated Pearl Harbor, that had enabled the German blitzkrieg, that had been the foundation of Japanese carrier warfare, were becoming nearly impossible to execute against a well-equipped enemy. American strategic planners in late 1945 and early 1946 recognized this immediately. They were already contemplating the next war, the war against the Soviet Union that many considered inevitable, and radar was central to their planning. The United States began constructing a network of early warning radar stations across the northern approaches to North America, from Alaska to Greenland. These stations, operating in the harshest climates on Earth, would provide warning of Soviet bomber attacks, giving American air defenses time to respond. But radar created a paradox. It made defense so effective that offense became almost suicidal, which in turn created pressure to develop weapons that could penetrate radar defenses. This led to the development of faster aircraft, electronic countermeasures, low observable stealth technology, and ultimately intercontinental ballistic missiles that flew too fast and too high for radar-directed defenses to intercept. The German engineers who were brought to the United States after the war, as part of Operation Paperclip, studied American radar with a mixture of admiration and resignation. They had developed the V-2 rocket, the Me-262 jet, advanced radar, and infrared systems of their own. But they had never achieved the integration, the industrial scale, the systematic deployment that characterized American radar. When they saw the rows of radar stations being constructed, the fleets of radar-equipped aircraft, the vast research programs devoted to improving every aspect of radar technology, they understood why Germany had lost. One such engineer, Dr. Ernst Weber, who had worked on the Würzburg radar during the war, wrote in a private letter in 1946, "We believed we were fighting a war of machines and courage. The Americans fought a war of information and industry. We built radar sets individually, like craftsmen making watches. They built them like automobiles, in factories, by the thousands, each one identical, each one reliable. We tried to detect their aircraft. They made detection routine, boring, a task for technicians rather than specialists. In the end, they did not defeat us with superior technology. They defeated us with superior systems." This observation captured the essence of America's technological advantage. It was not that American scientists were smarter than German or British scientists. It was that American industry could take a scientific breakthrough and turn it into a mass-produced tool, deployed so widely that it became commonplace. The Manhattan Project had demonstrated this with atomic weapons, taking theoretical physics and transforming it into industrial reality in less than 3 years. Radar demonstrated the same principle on a larger scale. American industry had produced more radar sets during the war than all other nations combined, and was continuing to improve them at a pace that other nations could not match. The tests continued through the fall of 1945 and into 1946. New aircraft were flown against the radar systems, captured Japanese fighters, experimental jets, even a captured German AR-234 jet bomber that had been shipped to the United States for evaluation. The results were consistent. Modern radar could detect and track any aircraft in the sky, regardless of its speed, altitude, or maneuverability. The implications extended beyond military applications. Civil aviation was beginning its post-war expansion, and radar would make it possible for aircraft to fly safely in all weather, to navigate precisely without visual references, to land in fog and darkness. The same technology that had hunted U-boats and guided night fighters could now manage air traffic and prevent collisions. American commercial radar companies, Raytheon, Bendix, Hazeltine, began developing civil aviation radar based on military designs. By 1946, major airports were installing radar approach control systems, and airlines were equipping their aircraft with weather radar that could detect thunderstorms and turbulence from miles away. The green glow of the radar scope began appearing in air traffic control towers, where controllers used it to manage the flow of aircraft with a precision and safety that had been impossible before the war. This civilian application of military technology was characteristically American, the rapid transfer of innovation from warfare to commerce, the belief that technology should be exploited for economic gain as much as military advantage. European nations, devastated by war, could barely maintain their military radar networks, let alone develop civilian applications. The Soviet Union poured resources into military radar but had no commercial aviation industry to speak of. Only America had the wealth, the industrial capacity, and the culture of innovation to transform radar from a weapon of war into a tool of peaceful commerce in a matter of months. The epilogue of this story takes place not in 1945 or 1946, but decades later, when the full impact of radar became clear. The Cold War became, in many ways, a radar war. American early warning systems ringed the Soviet Union, tracking every aircraft, every missile test, every military movement. Soviet radar responded in kind, creating a stalemate of mutual observation. Neither side could launch a surprise attack because neither side could hide its preparations. This transparency, this inability to conceal military action, may have prevented World War III. When you cannot surprise your enemy, when your movements are tracked in real time, when launching an attack guarantees immediate detection and retaliation, warfare becomes irrational. The radar systems tested at Patuxent River in September 1945 were the ancestors of everything that followed: the WW2, NORAD, the Aegis Combat System, airborne early warning aircraft, over-the-horizon radar, phased array radar, synthetic aperture radar, and eventually the radar satellites that can map the Earth through clouds and darkness. The green glow of those oscilloscope screens evolved into the multicolor displays of modern air defense centers, where operators manage thousands of tracks simultaneously, where artificial intelligence assists in target identification, where the electromagnetic spectrum is mapped and exploited with a sophistication that the engineers of 1945 could barely imagine. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged: information is power. The side that can see its enemy while remaining unseen, that can track hostile movements while concealing its own, that can predict intentions and position forces accordingly, that side holds an advantage more decisive than any weapon. Radar gave America that advantage in 1945, and America maintained it through continuous innovation and overwhelming investment. The pilots who flew against the radar systems that September morning understood, perhaps better than anyone, what they had experienced. They had flown the best aircraft that the Second World War produced, had employed tactics refined through years of combat, had used every advantage of speed and maneuverability and pilot skill. And they had been tracked effortlessly, their every movement visible on screens they could not see, by operators who calmly called out their positions as if reading from a script. Years later, Captain Raymond Ford, the Mustang pilot, was interviewed about that day. He said, "I realized then that the war we had just fought was already obsolete. Everything we had learned about air combat, about sneaking up on your enemy, about using sun and clouds for cover, about the importance of seeing the other guy before he sees you, all of it was finished. The next war would be fought by machines that could see through clouds, through darkness, through the curve of the earth. And the guys who controlled those machines would be sitting in rooms hundreds of miles away, watching green screens, moving us around like pieces on a chessboard." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't heroic, but it was devastatingly effective. That's what American technology meant, not that we had better planes or braver pilots, but that we had made bravery and skill less important than information. We had turned warfare into engineering. And you can't fight engineering with courage. This was the deeper truth that radar revealed, that modern war had become too fast, too complex, too vast for human perception alone. The human eye could not see beyond the horizon. The human ear could not hear a bomber formation at 50 miles. But radar could. And in a world where information moved at the speed of light, the nation that controlled that information controlled the battlefield. The green glow on those oscilloscope screens, flickering in darkened rooms at Patuxent River and 1,000 other stations across America and its overseas bases, was the light of a new era, an era where vigilance was electronic, where vision was electromagnetic, where the invisible had become visible and the night had become transparent. It was the light of American technological supremacy, not born from a single genius or a lone breakthrough, but from the systematic application of scientific knowledge, industrial capacity, and organizational will. It was the light that said, "We can see you, we can track you, we can predict you, and you cannot hide." That light still burns today, in radar stations and air traffic control towers, aboard warships and aircraft, in satellites and ground stations around the world. It is the light of awareness, of information, of control. It is the light that turned the sky from an infinite void into a mapped and measured space, where every movement is noted and every object identified. And it began on a cold September morning in 1945, when the best pilots flying the best aircraft learned that they could not escape the invisible electromagnetic net that America had woven across the sky, that they were visible, always visible, tracked by a technology they could not see and could not fight. The age of the invisible hunter had begun, and America held the spotlight.